century in the United States of America was the 1858 Layman's Prayer Revival. The one who has recorded this so much for us is J. Edwin Orr, the late Dr. Orr, who spoke on campus here back during the 80s, elderly man. And he has recorded a lot of what happened during that period of time, not only in the United States, but around the world. 1858. It began in a prayer meeting in New York City, as far as we can determine. But there were stirrings of God's Spirit earlier than that, even particularly in Canada, mentioned sometimes. One man called for a prayer meeting, and it seemed like it was just at the right time. Very few people showed up at first, and then it grew. And then what happened was a financial panic, and that financial panic filled the churches, not only that church, but other churches, with people, till eventually every church in New York City was filled with people praying. And when Dr. Orr says this, we say, every church? Yeah, every church. The Catholic churches? Yes, the Catholic churches. The Unitarian church? Yes, the Unitarian church. He says, I mean, every church. Every church opened the doors. People were coming to pray during this time of need. And this spread. It spread not only across the United States, but around and around the world as well. There's a man by the name of William Taylor. And William Taylor became, I guess, kind of a special inspiration to me in regards to this. William Taylor was a Methodist, and he followed the gold rush to California, and actually preached, and became a street preacher out there to the people who were out trying to get rich quick. He returned to the East and got caught up in this time of awakening, and he became an evangelist involved in different places, and then believed that God was calling him to a worldwide ministry. William Taylor went to South Africa. William Taylor went to India. He went to Australia. He went to Central America, I believe, at some point. And Tasmania mentioned, yes.
What time, what year?
This would be
In the
later 1800s.
Okay.
1870 is mentioned for one of these times. It would be after the 1858 awakening. Okay. And a big part of what he did in these places was to come to these people and tell them what God had done in the United States in this prayer revival. And there's some account about his time. I think the first place he went, I think, was Australia, and then Tasmania, and then it spread out in the islands. And when he came from there to South Africa, he said very religious people were, but just feeling like the work was hopeless, nothing's happening, and so on in that way. And he wouldn't accept that. And so he looked for open doors, and he began to preach to some of the tribal people. I believe the Zulu people were involved at that point. But there was a young man who became his translator. And later on, that young man would become a very famous African evangelist. His name was Charles Pamla, P-A-M-L-A. And they said that his ministry then extended for about 50 years afterwards. And so, in a way, Taylor's ministry was expanded through this. What did he do? He'd come and he'd say, Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. This is what God is doing in this place. This is what God is doing in that place. And discouraged Christians, sleeping Christians, would start praying and would get hopeful. And that's the part of it that I think is a real encouragement. It seems to me that a large part of his ministry was telling what God was doing in other places or what he had done in the past, and God's people becoming hopeful, believing that Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. They began to see some exciting, powerful things happening in their ministries as well. And this guy kept on until he was an old man, going, preaching, open doors. I think at one time he was something like the Methodist bishop or something of Africa. I don't know. They gave him some big title. And then it was something similar in Central America, where he came in and inspired the people to be hopeful, to be prayerful, to see what God was going to do. And waves of revival in these different places. Did I mention India? Yes, he was in India too. Another place where he traveled and found Christians discouraged, accepting the status quo, whatever. This is the best we can hope for in these difficult days. And people got prayerful, people got hopeful, and they saw what God could do. Now, that's an encouragement to me. And that was an encouragement to me back here in the 90s to record the story of a revival that was virtually being forgotten. In the histories, there'll be just like a little blurb, or maybe a paragraph or something like that. Well, there was this that happened, and it was probably quite significant, but not much about it at all. And so I looked around and dug around, and I thought, has anybody tried it? Because at that point, it was about 100 years since that had happened. The 1990s would be about 100 years since it happened before. And I thought, I wonder if there'd be some opportunity to sit down and work on this. And I started in the 80s. Putting it together. And then published it in a book in the late 90s. Conley's brother, Loyal, was one who had encouraged me. I put it together first in a thesis at Bethel Seminary. And there it sat on the shelves and kind of got forgotten, like theses do. And Pastor Dyrud's brother read it, and he said to me, you need to condense this, do some work with it, and put it into a book. And I said, boy, I really would like to, but I don't have time. That winter, I got sick with viral pneumonia, and I was laid up for weeks. I couldn't come in, anything like that, and would try to come in for a day, and it just didn't work. And so what I could do was sit at my computer and work at some of the things. So this book is a product of viral pneumonia. Yeah. The Lord had to put me aside for a while and give me time in order to get it done. And so it was done in time for the 100th anniversary of this awakening movement. And the thesis is much larger than this, and there are things in the thesis that aren't in this, and then there were things that I learned afterwards, after I wrote the thesis, that were added to this as well. What happened? And you've read some of this, heard some of it before. But I relate it to people who were hopeful, first of all, people who were hopeful, remembering what God had done in the countries from which they came. They had seen revival, or their parents had seen revival. There was a heritage of revival, particularly in Norway, that was really very powerful. And when they came to this country, they would talk about Hauge, and they would talk about Gisli Onsen, and they would remember these people and what had been done. Some of them had had Johnson as a teacher, and they believed that this was something that was needed in this country as well. One of the things that, and I'll agree with Odd Lovell from, used to be at St. Olaf College, who calls this a myth. He says the myth is that our ancestors came to this country very pious, very religious, and built churches before they built barns. No, this is not true. This is not true. Certainly there were believers among them, but among the Scandinavian people, the record of church involvement when they got over here, majority of them were really glad to leave the church behind. Yeah.
I just think it's a very good point, Bob, about hopeful people in a very difficult situation.
Yeah.
I called Oséias Camara, from Brazil.
Yeah.
And he's been going through some very difficult time and changes in the mission work in the church. And he said it has forced me to reflect on my life and on the life of the church in Brazil. And he says I've been reading now from Hauge, the Norwegian, and his life and his revivals, and other books in the Brazilian history too of revivals. And it's quite interesting. He's been put on the shelf. He loves to read. Yeah. And
he's got time to do it.
It's a time to do it. Yeah. And I just thought it was interesting. I just called him on Friday, and he just brought that up because the Lord has put him on the shelf. Yeah. And now it's a time for reading and reflection and revival is how the Lord can start revival. So hopeful.
Well, you think about what it meant to be a immigrant to this country. First of all, you left your family behind. Probably most of your family members, and you probably would never see them again. Never see them again in your life. It would be like if when you came to Bible school, if you'd said to your folks, your grandparents, or so on, well, bye. Yeah. And if you were probably a Scandinavian, you would have shook hands, bye. Yeah, don't want to get too emotional. Say this would be, and you would come. In the first place, you'd come into a country where you didn't speak the language, and this is true of all the different immigrant groups, not just the Scandinavians, and you would be probably laughed at. You would be considered probably to be stupid. You certainly talked funny. Some material that I read from the Methodists and the Congregationalists is laughable today as you read it. And they said, we like the immigrants from Northern Europe. And the impression that comes through is that they're kind of slow, but they're reliable, And the one just cute comment in one of them, they said, they come from a northern country where it's cold. And so they go home in the evening. They're not out partying or something like that. They go home where it's warm, That was the way it came through. And they make good servants. That's what comes through in some of it. There was a paper in southwestern Minnesota where the only comment was made was another drunken Norwegian fell in the lake. They didn't even give his name. Yeah, just that was the way it came. Scandinavians had a very, what would you say, very strong reputation for drunkenness. And that would be kind of a general characteristic, And we know some of that. Maybe those of you of Scandinavian descent know some of that in your own relationship, probably,
Bender drinking.
Yeah.
And I suppose it's because of being so far north. You don't see the sun.
Sweden had the highest degree of, I don't know, what is it, alcoholism, whatever they called it at that time, alcohol consumption of any country in Europe. Really, and part of it was living in these isolated valleys. It was easier to take your crop, your grain, and turn it into liquor than it was to transport the grain. And so you could have a still or whatever it took and make it into an alcoholic beverage and carry a bottle. where you wouldn't have to carry a whole load of the grain to do it. But yeah, they'd give hard alcohol to babies to help them sleep and keep them quiet, you know, and stuff like that. It was just a terrible abuse, and they brought that to this country as well. If you were working for someone, you weren't doing real well, you came out here to the Midwest to get land. And it would mean coming usually into a piece of land where you had to clear it, you had to pick the rock, you had to break ground, all the rest. It was, yeah. Any of you read well, you have, Giants in the Earth, yeah.
Yes.
Ole Rovag talking about it, and I think of the poor lady there like losing her mind, you know, in the midst of the prairie, looking around and seeing nothing in every direction, you know, and nobody around, no neighbors and all the rest. Yeah, this is pretty fearful. I remember our first night in the parsonage in Helmer, looking out the window, and it was in January, where Hannah lived too, and you could see as far as the eye could see in every direction. I mean, the corn was down and the rest. It was pure prairie, and my wife said she loved it because nobody can sneak up on you there. There weren't any trees in the way in any direction. But you know, people who came from a mountainous country, people who came from forest country, coming into something like this, can you imagine what it might have been for them in terms of an adjustment? And the church in the old country was a state church, and they felt no responsibility for people over here. Anybody who left was like an outlaw. You were leaving the church. You were coming to this land to get away from it. That was the kind of the general feeling. And the first pastor to come over was not a pastor. He among the Norwegian Lutherans, he was a lay evangelist. Elling Eilson came down into the Fox River country there in Illinois, and people were having house meetings and the rest, and some of those who were believers, and he came and he preached and evangelized and got into a lot of trouble. But really just a remarkable ministry this man had in the church. And after him, I think the second pastor was another layman who was sent over. He was a teacher, Klaus Clausen, and he was sent over because of a man whose son was over here and walking away from the Lord, and he said, I'll pay your way to go over if you go over and try to minister to these people. They need a church. It was only after that you'd see a few pastors daring to come and to work. The believers, the handful of believers in some of these communities were struggling and trying to get some semblance of a church going. And this, yeah, very true, I think, for most of the groups. Most of the immigrant groups, there wasn't a real strong religious presence among them, and there wasn't a responsibility felt in the old country as far as ministering to them. The people, there were those, let's put it that way, among these people in this great time of need who remembered revival and remembered stories of revival. And there were some who were hopeful and prayerful. We don't find any mass movement of prayer beforehand recorded. In some instances, you find that in times of revival. You don't with this one. What you find at the beginning is a fight, a church fight. Yeah, over a school. And that school, the remnant of it is still located here in the Twin Cities, Augsburg College. They had moved here, started in 1869 down in Wisconsin, moved here into the Twin Cities, and much supported by all of the elite from the Twin Cities, well-to-do people, helped raise money to bring it in because they thought it'd be a good thing to have a college here. They, in a church merger time, and I won't go into a lot of details of that, there came to be a controversy over the ownership of the college and seminary, and the program, developing the program, and keeping the program. And in the midst of this, people were at one another and fighting and angry. And then there was an evangelist who came. Well, he wasn't. He was a missionary. And you've heard about him in class, Lars Skrefsrud. Skrefsrud, there needs to be a new biography of him in English. Maybe some of you will get sick and write that sometime. Huh? Yeah. Skrefsrud was an ex-convict. Norwegian mission societies wouldn't send him out, and he ended up coming through a German mission society, partnered with an older Danish fellow, and they went up into the northeastern part of India to work among a tribal people who were also under the, it was similar, I think, in some ways to the American Indians or to the Laplanders in northern Scandinavia, where they were victimized by liquor dealers. And the alcoholism really was quite strong. And Skrefsrud had a gift for languages, was able to translate the Bible into the language of these people, preach in their language in no time. It seemed like a wonderful breakthrough. And there was a people movement, a mass evangelistic outreach that was significant in the Christian world. They heard about him in England, sent him support. And they heard about him in America. And a professor from Augsburg, Professor Blagen, his name was, he wrote and he said, "Can't you come to America and tell us about what's happening in India? We want to get behind missions. And if you could come and tell us about this, it would be such an encouragement to us," and so on. And finally, he agreed to come. And Skrefsrud came, and I've picked up all these different stories in different places about him. Some of them are here in the book. They have, I think at Luther Seminary in their archives, Skrefsrud's pipe. I've been told that it used to sit over there at any rate. He was, I don't know, any of you know where Fort Ransom, North Dakota is? I don't know. South east of Valley City. He was preaching there, and they said, with his pipe in his mouth, and his hat blew off his head, and there's some big story in connection with that. But when he preached in that church, they drew the wagons, people outside the church, opened the windows because the crowds were so great, wanting to hear this man. He was like a celebrity. And the newspapers had front page articles, "Skrefsrud is coming." They wanted to hear him, and there was gossip about him, all kinds of things. And he was a widower, by the way, at this time. He got sick, and he took a few weeks off out here at a home on Lake Minnetonka. And there's a picture of him in one of the books out fishing. And he's sitting in this boat by himself, and he's got a hat on, a Homburg, or a dress hat on, and his suit. It looks like he's sitting there. It's not exactly a relaxed-looking picture. They tried to match him up with a young lady while he was here too, but he didn't have time for anything like that. So he was committed to the work. But it was what he wrote was, he'd come to these churches and people would say, "What side are you on?" "What do you mean, what side?" "Well, where do you stand on the Augsburg controversy? Are you on the side of Augsburg, or are you on the side of the United Church?" And it was, "What? I'm not on anybody's side. I'm on the Lord's side." And they tried to draw him into their controversies. And finally, he came to the conclusion, well, I shouldn't say finally, quite quickly, that what was needed was not to come and tell people about the work in India. What was needed was to call people to repentance. And he had no time for anything else. And he went around from church to church. He had, opportunities everywhere. And preached all over the Midwest. Preached at church conventions, went out to country churches, wherever he was invited. The Professor Blagen from Augsburg was keeping track of his schedule. And I see Skrefsrud as kind of the plow in this time. He came with a law message, and there wasn't necessarily immediately moments of revival under his preaching, but it would be afterwards when it would come. And he came and he gave him the business, He came in and said, "You miserable sinners, you're fighting about this church stuff and everything. You need to get down on your knees, humble yourselves before God and repent." The one story I include, some fellow comes up to him outside of a church and says, "Lars, don't you remember me? I'm from your hometown in Norway." And Skrefsrud had said, "Are you saved?" And the man was kind of taken aback, and he said, "Well, I'm the klukker. I'm a leader in the church, a lay leader in the church." Skrefsrud, "Giddy up," he said. He was God. He didn't have any time for any small talk or anything like that at all. He was there. And then the kind of infamous story in the Osakis area where he went into the church and said to the people, "Is there anybody here who prays?" Packed church full of people, and then I guess he didn't even preach a message there. He said, "Best thing I can do for you is to go back to India and have the believers there pray for you." Imagine something of the people who had come to hear him, how they felt about something like that. Is that Salem? I don't remember which church it was.
Probably Sauk Valley.
Sauk Valley Church, yeah. Full church. It wasn't necessarily when he was there, but it was afterward. They tell of one story where he was preaching in what would have been the old St. Paul's Church, I believe, here in Minneapolis, the old Hauge Church. And he had said, "There's somebody here, somebody here who is resisting, somebody here who needs the Lord." And afterwards, after he was gone back to the old country, or back to India, I should say, there was a man who came at another meeting and said, "I was that one that night," he said, "who was resisting the Spirit of God." He was pretty dramatic. And people who heard him preach in other areas, in England, for example, said he was one of the finest preachers of that day, worldwide. Just an incredible gift of preaching that God had given to this man. Gift of prophecy, as well as maybe with all his use of languages. How many languages? I don't remember. No, 40? Something like that he could handle. He had a gift of tongues too, right? Yeah, all right. All of these things coming together. But it was others afterward then who did the work of reaping. The work of reaping. And there's some unusual people in connection with that. And one of the things that we learn about revival is expect the unexpected. I delighted in some of the visits and correspondence that I had with two elderly ladies, identical twin sisters from Tim's home community, Tilda and Lena Vangstedt. They were professors, retired professors from Valley City State College, or what do they call it now, Valley City University, I guess. And neither one ever married. Identical twins, dressed identically, usually. I remember one night going to their home with some Christmas carolers when they lived in Valley City, and they were dressed in identical housecoats when they came to the door. I never knew it at the time, but when the first one passed away, they were the oldest living twins in the world. I think they were well over 100 when they died, and somebody told me the way you could tell the difference between the two is one had an engagement ring on, and she had been engaged, and her fiance had died in the military. Wasn't it military?
I believe he got sick and threw himself out of a second-story window of a building.
Oh, okay.
I don't think it was in the military.
Wasn't in the military.
No.
All right. I never got any details on that. Some of the people were talking about it afterwards. But at her funeral, they did recognize, in fact, some of his family as being among her survivors. But when the man she was going to marry died, she and her sister agreed then that they would live together and never get married. And they had their career. Their parents were products of the revival in that community. They referred to them as casualties of the revival, kind of comically. But they said that they grew up in that atmosphere and with those stories of what had happened during that time. And they, when I was in contact with them, I suppose in their 90s then, passing on a lot of that information to me right out of their own family, which was really quite incredible. It's like a primary source, I contacted churches where I could find record of revival, some little remark made somewhere, and the response in most cases was, we don't know anything about it. It was forgotten. It was forgotten. And but some did a really incredible job of recording what happened during that time, and there's some with a real heart for that. One of those churches that did a really good job of recording it was Ebenezer in Northwood, North Dakota. Lots of information there in their heritage, their history. Another one which did a good, I think a very good job with this, was a church south of the Twin Cities at Farmington, near Farmington, the Highview Christiania Lutheran Church. And there was a pastor in more recent years, I think maybe at the time of their centennial, who recorded all of this down and really did an excellent job in talking to some of the old timers there and putting it down. Mm-hmm.
I think this is one of the most important things, is recording your, journaling through times like this, because in the Bible, it always is that.
Yeah.
It's going back. Remember, going all the way back, mm-hmm. Stephen, or whatever you want to call him, before he was stoned.
Yeah.
He went all the way back to remember, going all the way back to the time of Abraham.
There's a lot of references in the Scripture to remember, isn't there? To remember. And those who have recorded some of those things and put it down for us to pass on, we are really indebted to them. We have copies out there of Pastor Trygve Dahli's autobiography. He was an AFLC pastor, early AFLC pastor. And he records in there about hearing one of these preachers out of that time speak. I have a letter in my files from a man from Hatton, North Dakota, originally from Hatton. He was living out in the West Coast then, and he told me about hearing someone else, one of these preachers, speak at that time. And it's comical. He said he was just a little boy, and he said he could remember this man and the long beard, and he said he would walk across the front of the church when he was speaking, and it was a wooden floor, and he kind of thump, 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 and that impressed this little kid, his feet on this wooden floor. And then he said when he would preach, he would stroke his beard, and his hand would go down on the beard. And he said, I'd wait for it to get to the bottom, but then he'd go back up and start again before he got to the bottom. So it must have been quite a long beard. But these were his memories as a child. Pastor Dolly said that what he remembered was during the service up in northern Minnesota. During the service, all of a sudden, a lady's starting to cry, get down on her knees, crawled up to the front of the church, as I remember, and the pastor, the speaker, stepping down and pronouncing the word of absolution to this lady. Your sins are forgiven for Jesus' sake. And the woman set free and went back to her seat again, and the pastor didn't even hardly break from his sermon, I guess. It was all a part of it in that way too. When we think of some of these different individuals who God uses, I think of Peter Nielsen, and he's the one with the beard and that I'm mentioning here at this point, Peter Nielsen. And he was a pastor of a church here in Minneapolis. St. Luke's Church doesn't exist anymore in South Minneapolis. And he was called by Augsburg to be a fundraiser. And the curious thing about it was the same thing happened to him as happened to Skrefsrud. As he went out and started preaching, he saw the need wasn't for fundraising. The need was to minister to spiritually needy people. And the best fundraising thing that he could do was to preach Christ. According to some of the things that I've read, they said of Nielsen, he didn't preach an evangelistic message. Preached to Christians. He was a true revival preacher, is the way that they talk about him, a true revival preacher. And one of the things that he often talked about was the congregation, and your place in the congregation, how this was such an important part of the life of a new believer, a revived believer, to be a part of a fellowship of other believers. I should mention the other congregation, too, that did a good job. The congregation doesn't exist anymore. Did a wonderful job of recording what happened during this time. And that was Gethsemane Lutheran Church near Tulna, North Dakota. And it's the home church of Pastor Jim Rasmussen. And they put together really an incredible history telling of what had happened at that time. And that congregation, back a number of years ago, maybe 20 years ago now, it might be, finally closed its doors. But they began in a revival, movement of revival. And one of the things about it, they record what was going on at that time. And there was a service, a meeting of some kind, practically daily. Practically daily, it was going on, one after another after another. They kept a schedule of 1 week, and it was a testimony meeting, it was a prayer meeting, it was a Bible study, it was all these different things going on. And one of the things that really struck me about it, reading that schedule, I have it recorded somewhere in the book, was during these times of awakening, God's people just love to be together. They love to be together. Look for opportunities for fellowship. Look for opportunities for prayer. And I mentioned Taylor, first of all. Taylor began his ministry when he was 20 years old. And one of the things that really strikes me about these periods of time of revival is that because of the sheer, intensity of it, it usually takes younger people. Usually takes younger people. If you look at the age of some of these people, when God first began to use them in a time of revival, in their 20s, in their 30s maybe, that's probably getting a little long in the tooth. To be able to keep up that kind of schedule and to keep going without burning out. The older folks are there to pray, to encourage, and to mentor the new believers. But those who are really at the burning edge of revival are usually young people. Usually young people. And I think that needs to be a significant encouragement to you as well, as God awakens more of a hopefulness in your hearts. When people ask me about the book, they usually ask about Edward Breckhus, the sleep preacher. And I just was reading again now a history of the Covenant denomination, doing some background in that. And Carl Olson, in his book, By One Spirit, has a whole section in there about the Swedish sleep preachers. I was in contact with a researcher from out east, I think, Pennsylvania, by email. And she has written a piece about a Finnish lady sleep preacher, I suppose, is what you would call her. She would be somebody who was speaking when she was unconscious, telling about that. And she had gathered some material about her. One of the Bible school students first year asked me, what do you think of that? What is your opinion of that? And I said, I have to just kind of stand back and say, I don't know. I've never seen it, never experienced it. There were some people very critical of it, and I think of Breckhus himself. At a certain point in his ministry, he prayed to God that if this was a distraction or if this was not of the Lord, that God would take it away, and God took it away. But during a period of time, there was something happening that he didn't understand, and other people didn't understand as well. And I point out in the book that one of the founders of the Augustana Synod, one of the most honored Swedish Lutheran pastors in America, was Eric Norelius. And this happened to him when he was a young man in Sweden. And so it wasn't something of some crackpot fringe or anything like that. It was something very, very unusual that happened. And I believe when some of these things come, if you read stories about more recently about revival in Indonesia, breakthrough into new areas, something that I heard a pastor say at one time, he said, did you know that there are more Christians? What do you know about Indonesia, first of all? Largest what? Muslim country in the world. All right, here. There are more Christians in Indonesia than there are people in Australia. In terms of perspective, thinking of the huge population of that country. And there have been areas there where there's been powerful moving of God's Spirit and some really strange things happening. Really strange things happening. And I believe that, I remember when Richard Owen Roberts spoke to us back in the 1980s. He said, there's going to be some things happening that are going to make your eyes get kind of wide sometimes. Things that you don't understand, things that maybe you're concerned about. He said, if you don't get in there as mature, Bible-grounded Christians, he said, there will be some nut that will be there who will be ready to carry it off into strange fire. He said, you've got to be there to work with it where it is and carry it forward, and by God's grace. I thought that was a very important warning. And he talked about Davenport at the time of the first Great Awakening in America, and he said, just a nutcase. And he said, we need the balance. Yes, sir.
Where did you get that information about Indonesia? That is incredible.
Yeah, I don't know. That's incredible too, huh?
Yes.
No.
I mean,
no, it was a mission speaker that I heard, and he gave that perspective. He said we forget that sometimes in the sheer size of the population of that country. We think of that, this huge Muslim country, more Christians there than there are people in Australia.
Because I would almost say the same thing about Brazil. Brazil is the largest Catholic country in the world.
Mm-hmm.
But there are more people who are on fire for Jesus Christ there than I think in many of the South American countries.
May well be, yeah. So it's perspective, with it. Yes.
Indonesia pretty open then?
No,
not at all.
Not at all. No.
I have a friend, she's teaching there at an international school. She
Yeah.
graduated from that.
Okay. Very difficult. Very difficult. There's a, I don't know, Nobel Prize-winning author. I think he's Nobel. Famous author anyway. Nepal. Naipaul or Pal. V.S. Nepal. And he's written, he's of Indian descent who was born and raised in Trinidad. And he comes from kind of a sort of a general Hindu background, I guess, lives in England, studied in England, and he made a trip to several of these non-Arab, 2 trips, several of these non-Arab Muslim countries, and wrote a book on both trips. And he went to Indonesia, he went to Iran, he went to Pakistan, I'm trying to think where else, but non-Arab Muslim countries. And he and it was a 10-year period between his 2 visits. Tried to contact the same people, and he said about Indonesia that there's a radical Islamic movement in there that is becoming more and more oppressive toward Christians. You have the one little island of Hinduism there, Bali, in the midst of it all. But in some areas, if you look over into like Papua New Guinea and some of that going over in that direction, very strong Christian presence. There's been, but in some of the islands there's been a strong movement of spiritual awakening. Not easy, yeah. Other questions that come up as I ramble here.
Now, what again? Maybe on the following Monday, but you say that revival comes from generally from the law preaching person.
Well,
and people who at least are hopeful generally are the ones that are used.
The law plows the way.
Yeah.
But the law doesn't create life.
No.
Only creates death. Only creates death. But when I talk about the time of crisis and the people who are almost hopeless because of the things that are happening and fighting one another and all the rest of that in there. One of the things that is kind of a precursor of revival, I think, is a sense of helplessness. That we actually do come to a place where we haven't got another program that we can throw at what's wrong. We're great at that in the Western world. What's wrong in your church? Your church lacks spiritual life. We have a program for it, and we put out a manual, and there are student books, and 14 lessons of how to have a revival. Americans invented this stuff, I think, and we blame Charles Finney for it sometimes, and I think rightly so, because Finney really did try to systematize revival. If you're interested in some of this, there's a book in the library called Revival and Revivalism, by Ian Murray. Yeah, Ian Murray, Revival or Revivalism, where he talks about the true and the false in connection with it. And the hopefulness that I have in regards to Finney is that there's a book that he wrote later on in his ministry where he recognized how some of this had gone and talked against it. He said, where in the world did you get the idea that revival was something that we could manufacture? Well, kind of got it from you, Charlie, a little bit, but some of the things he had to say. But he was, what he saw some things that God blessed. And so he came and said, see, you can see the transition. Rather than conducting revival, he began teaching people how to have revival. And so then he said, if you do these things that God blessed in my ministry, in his revival lectures, and where he actually comes out and says, I can guarantee you that you're going to have this kind of a result too, if you do the right things in that way. And out of that came a mechanized kind of revivalism, and I think pretty much manufactured in the United States of America, that was spread around. And I use the examples sometime in connection with that. First time I ever heard of special meetings referred to as revivals was in Grand Forks, North Dakota. And I remember somebody inviting me and a friend to go to, there was a revival in their church, Southern denomination. And I said, whoa, that's something. And well, we couldn't come now. We had something going on in our own church. Oh, that's too bad. The revival's over on Thursday. And I remember the reaction was kind of like, well, what do you mean the revival is over on Thursday? How do you know the revival is going to? Yeah, well, but yeah, difference between a conference and a revival, though. Yeah, it's over. Yeah, it's over. But he said we'll have another one next year, or next spring, or next fall, or whatever it was. We'll have another one. Oh, and I picked up a book at Bethel back when I was doing some of this work, and it was I looked for everything I could find on revival. And this one book said, and it was talking about it purely in terms of special meetings. It says, well, some churches used to have 2-week revivals, and then it got harder to do that, so they had 1-week revival. And then now people are so busy that actually they're scheduling mini revivals, and just on a weekend. See, that works out good. A mini revival. Yes, sir.
There is a charismatic church. They say they're not a church, but a building that the church uses.
Yeah.
Over on 9 and 100, and it used to be in the Crystal Ballroom. It is the same building. And
On 9? County Road 9?
Right on it, but like a couple blocks off of
And
north of
100.
9 and 100.
Over in that Robbinsdale area then.
And every weekend they have revival meetings.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Haven't been able to get
Yeah,
that.
yeah. Well, it's a southern terminology, kind of, to just refer to the meetings that you have as being a revival. But the problem with that is that, as I said, revival becomes something mechanized. It becomes something that we create, that we schedule, and that we do, rather than that which is that surprises us. And I come back to that from Jonathan Edwards. His famous work at the time of the First Great Awakening was the faithful account of the surprising acts of God. And it was something like we prayed for it, we hoped for it, but when it came, it just, overwhelmed us. The surprising act of God. If there isn't something surprising about it,
What was that again?
a faithful account of the surprising acts of God. That's a shortened version of the title. These Puritans went for long titles, by the way. So, anyway, what I hoped to do with this, by God's grace, was to record, at least in part, the stories of that I could assemble of some of the things that God did and accomplished in various places and the people He used, so that people today would become hopeful. And the book was written with that prayer. The last point that I made, the task is still unfinished in at least 2 senses. The first is to remember. The first is to remember. Frustration is too weak a word to describe the emotions of this researcher while searching the historical records of congregations with a revival heritage and not finding any mention of spiritual awakening at all. The second unfinished task is to repent, therefore, and return, that your sins may be wiped away, in order that seasons of refreshing may come from the presence of the Lord. So much time may be spent remembering where we've been that we forget where we're going. Revival should be both a heritage and a hope. Precious memories of past springtimes may be cherished in our hearts, but best of all is when they create a living hope that the promise of still another new springtime may be fulfilled for our generation. God grant it. Amen. Okay. See you next week. Huh?
Now Monday you are going to?
I'm going to, where am I going to? Here. All right.
What are you going to do on next Monday?
Whatever you tell me to do, dear brother.
I asked you how, because the
Yes.
problem is
Yeah.
with projects.
Yeah,
you
yeah.
can schedule.
Yeah.
You alluded to it.
Yes, and so we will develop the illusion.
Yes.
All right.
We'll develop it.
Good.
Thank you.
Thank you.